Hello, everyone. Welcome back. The small but mighty crowd that stays till the very end. We really appreciate you so much. So for our final panel of the day, we wanted to give you, our audience, both here and virtually, the opportunity to ask questions of a panel of census experts. So we'll take questions from the mics in the room and also from our virtual attendees. So if you're watching virtually, please start putting your questions into the chat. And we've had a request that when you ask your question online or virtually, if you can put your name and your organization as well. Anonymous, that's okay. We know you want to stay anonymous, but if you would like to share that, that would be really wonderful. So we have a host of experts here, and rather than me reading everyone's bio, we're going to have each census representative introduce themselves, their title, and a bit about what they work on and oversee at the Census Bureau. So I'm going to turn it over to Donna Daly, and then she'll facilitate how this goes. And then I'll be running around with a microphone and monitoring the online questions that come in.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Okay. So I'm Donna Daly, the chief of the American Community Survey Office, and I have a great team up here, and I'm going to pass the mic. Why don't we start with you, Eli, if you introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. Again, I'm Elizabeth Pooler. Everybody calls me Eli, and I'm the Assistant Division Chief for Survey Methods for the survey, which means I oversee our experiments like content changes, as well as our administrative records research.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Nicole Scanello. I'm the Assistant Division Chief for Communications in the American Community Survey Office. So my office handles respondent and data user inquiries. We do outreach and training.
Hello, I don't have a sign, but I'm John Policino with the Geography Division in the Customer Engagement Branch. We respond to questions from users, and hopefully to do that today in regards to any of your geography-based questions, what they may be.
I'm Mark Asiala. I'm the Assistant Division Chief for ACS Statistical Design. Our area is responsible for the sampling, weighting, variance estimation, as well as the disclosure avoidance and the specification for the PUMs, which has had a lot of discussion today.
And I'm David Ragland. I'm Assistant Division Chief in the American Community Survey Office for Operational and Program Analytics. We calculate lots and lots of rates and do research into a wide variety of topics on the operational end of the survey.
Okay, so with that, love to answer questions from you guys or
We
online.
have one that came in from a virtual attendee. It says, what do you think of the creation of a new Middle Eastern North African MENA racial or ethnic category?
As an opinion, I think it's a great idea, but I think that the Census Bureau is working on a working group with OMB in order to create those new race standards. And we are working diligently through that process. So I understand that those are coming out in the summer of 2024 for those recommendations. But whatever those standards are and however they need to be applied to the ACS, we will follow through with that.
Questions from our audience? Nicole, do we have the questions that people asked in advance?
Okay. So one of the questions that people had was, in a time of declining public participation in surveys with a corresponding increase in online survey efficiency, why have there been no substantial increases in the ACS sample size? And this has come up repeatedly. We know that this is of great interest to our data user community.
So one of the first priorities that the Census Bureau, that the ACS program would take would be to expand our use of administrative records and blended data and modeled data products before we would expand or increase a sample size. We also would take advantage of any innovative methods in data collection in order to support and train our field staff so that they could use those new techniques and new ways to get to the hard to count groups in order to increase the response for the American Community Survey, especially in the in-person contact interviewing operation. We would do that before we would think about increasing the sample size. So I just want to put that out there. Yes, and Mark has some math things to add.
So one way how I have expressed this to people is you can think about that if we're having issues collecting data from those people who are, historically undercounted, is if we increase the sample size, you don't necessarily increase the representation from those groups. So, and there would be a bias in our estimates because those people aren't properly represented. But what we would have with an increased sample size are smaller margins of error on an answer, a data point that we know doesn't properly represent that group. So it's much more advantageous for us to spend ways on how to enhance our data collection to have those groups better represented in the data so that the ACS data truly reflects the total population that we have.
Mallory Bateman. I'm the State Data Center Steering Committee Chair, and I'm from Utah. And this is kind of piggybacking off and not really a technical question, but is there any kind of more public-facing communications campaign for the ACS? Because once a quarter, I get at least 10 phone calls of people freaking out that their grandmother got the survey and they don't know what to do. And especially in the past couple of years, having the decennial, people think it's fake. And so I'm just wondering if there's any, I know you guys get out in the community, but we're all kind of limited, but a broader communications approach.
Yeah, that's a great question, Mallory. And it's something that we grapple with because communication campaigns are incredibly expensive and have such a broad reach that they're not going to be as effective for the ACS. A survey that is out there every day of the year, but for a very small proportion of the population, it's hard to know, when you could make a splash, let's say. There's no good timing for that, but we have had some good conversations with our new Office of Strategic Alliances. They have national partnerships, and we also have other areas in the Census Bureau with more regional partnerships. And we're starting to talk about those issues and how do we promote the ACS. And I think what we're thinking is it's really more through partnerships across the country. So reaching out to people that have then that local reach and can actually get the word out. Places like media stories. So we will sometimes see media features like news on your side, was this a legitimate survey? So having some toolkits perhaps available and outreach for law enforcement, people who might receive questions about the legitimacy of the survey. So we are thinking about those things, but unfortunately, I don't think that there is budget or really a good justification for like broad media campaigns, but we're thinking about how to develop further promotions for the survey. All right, I'm going to kick one to Dave because this had come in. Sorry, Dave, I'm putting you on the spot. But this is a good one because this might be good for like a new data user. So we did receive a question about what does it mean that we have a rolling sample? What does that really mean that the ACS has a rolling sample?
Well, I'll take a stab and Mark may jump in too. Mark's very familiar with this also. So when the ACS was conceived, the idea is to publish data like the long form down to a very small level geography, like we do block group. And getting enough sample in any one year would be, too much. It would be too hard to do that continuously. So the idea was we would collect data every year And every 5 years, we'd have enough data pooled to be able to publish these smaller levels. And then the next year, but then we wouldn't do it like 5 years and wait 5 more years. Every year, we put out new data. So like when we released the 17 to 21 data, we had the data we released in 16, using 2016 to 2020. Next year, we release 17 to 21, basically, and this is an oversimplification, but basically dropping the data from 16 and adding the data from 21 in. So you think of it sort of as like as a tractor with one of those rolling treads. And, there's always, new one coming in and old one going out every year. Okay, I guess I covered it pretty well. Good.
All right, the virtual question is from Cheryl Payam, and they are from the New York State Comptroller's Office. Their question is, the Census Bureau has been successful at popularizing and facilitating access to its data products for people who just want to pull a number out of a data set. Describe the ways in which they might contribute to shaping the changes coming that were discussed today, such as the use of synthetic data.
Well, I mean, they certainly could do, communicate with us when we talk about what data products we have or the synthetic data, but there's different levels of data user, I guess would be my answer. And a person pulling like one number for a paper somewhere probably isn't going to really be focused on, how the data got there. They're trying to get a number and they want it to be quality, and they assume because it's coming from us that it's a quality number. We have a brand and that we've built up over the years. But then we also have the users, like I'm looking around the room right now, who know much more about the ACS and can contribute the more detailed input to us. That would be my answer. I mean, we certainly would take any input from a person who just goes in and pull a number. It isn't like we don't want their input, but they probably aren't going to have as much input. Is that getting at what I think? I hope that's getting at. Maybe they'll respond whether we hit the mark or not on that.
Well, and I think I would just add that is sort of the question of the afternoon that Joe Salvo posed, and that it's something that we need to work on. We need to figure out how to incorporate data users into the development of disclosure avoidance modernization, developing products. We're not there yet, but I think, clearly, as Sally presented earlier today, that's something that they're working on. And then even within the Bureau, we have to work together to figure out how all these pieces are going to fit together and how we're going to incorporate our users.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I am new to ACS. Yay! exciting.
Welcome.
And I work in the election space. I know that you all put out a special tabulation for citizen voting age population.
Yeah.
Wondering if you guys have any extra tabulations that are coming down the pipeline. Very interested in it, but I think right now it's only providing CDAP data for race and at different like geometric or geography areas. Very interested in age, gender, sex, all of it really. Or any tips for trying to find CDAP data?
We have a few tables in our B28 series. So 28 is the topic number. And we have a few citizen voting age population tables. I can't remember exactly what are in those tables off the top of my head, what the breakouts are, but we have those in our standard data.census.gov release. So if you search for like B28 at the top, I know it's very cryptic, but trust me, I believe it's 28.
You can also search by characteristic. So if you search for citizenship on data.census.gov,
Mhm.
it should pull up a suite of tables that would be relevant to your inquiry.
Good afternoon. My name is Jonathan, and our team is down in Virginia, and we help provide different research and data products to affordable housing providers and local governments throughout the Commonwealth. And so the ACS just is very integral to our work, and it's always great to come here and absorb the conversation and trends, and just I've learned a lot. So I'm going to be that dreaded audience member with the two-part question. I'm very, very sorry. But hopefully they're good questions. So the first one is, we have been lucky enough to be able to become maybe a power user or a developer, I'm not sure, and use the API to do a lot of our work. And that has just been a huge boon for us. And we want to continue using it and leveraging it, because it just makes our work so much more efficient, and we can help our clients that much better. So I haven't heard, I don't think those three letters come up yet today. And so question number one is, to the extent that you guys are able, how can you project the API being incorporated for users like me into, your kind of future plans for the ACS and for the census infrastructure overall? And then number two, just came up with this as you were thinking about kind of communicating about the ACS. We try our best to explain the ACS and other census products to the folks that we interact with across the state, both our actual clients who understand the data pretty well, but also people who have never heard of the ACS before. We have to explain where the data comes from. Can you suggest any resources maybe that are already available that could help us have just kind of a quick, good elevator pitch or explanation for the ACS to folks when they ask us that question? Thank you.
So I can take the second part of your question pretty easily. We have a lot of resources on the website. I think one of the easiest things that we have available now for new users is this development of a new course about the ACS. I know that sounds intimidating. It's not a long course. The whole idea was to take the components of the ACS and break it down into bite-sized pieces. And we actually have staff in the back of the room. I do want to acknowledge our outreach and education branch. Come on, guys, you can stand up for a second, because this is the staff that answer data user questions. They're out traveling the country. They're a great resource. But if there's something that you're looking for that we don't have, please come see us afterward and provide your feedback, because we're not the ones using the resources. We're promoting them. We want to make sure they're effective and they're helping you do your job. And so thank you for promoting the ACS. I don't want to speak out of turn. In terms of the API, I am not aware of any plans to do away with it. Does anybody want to take that?
So Sally alluded to this somewhat early in her talk this morning about making the API somewhat easier to use, I think, is one design aspect. Certainly, it's an integral part of the data dissemination. It's used in delivering the tables that, for data.census.gov. We now have an API that also can address into the PUMS data as well. So it's very much part of the ecosystem. One aspect they are looking at is, can they make that data more friendly in terms of being able to understand how would you pull estimates from that? And that affects somewhat not just the API, but also the tables, but a lot of it's the back end to make it more friendly. So hopefully that will be an interesting development, but that's pretty early right now. So I don't have a lot of details on that.
Okay.
So I want to just go back to the sort of question about the less sophisticated data users who just, want a number. So I'm thinking, someone says, I want to know how many people in poverty have health insurance in this zip code. And so, you've got, in a way, you could give an easy answer. You can get that number in a way. You can say, well, as long as first of all, you have to understand it's not a zip code, it's a ZICTA, but you get past that. And then, you can give a number, but then say, well, not quite, that's not quite right, because there's a margin of error. It might be fairly substantial. okay, and then you might add in, if we go down the road and get into, there being synthetic data or something like that, you say, well, okay, sorry, it's not quite just an estimate with a margin of error. It's also got this layer of, data protection on it. And so I guess the question is sort of, do you want unsophisticated users to use the data, or is it in a sense kind of too dangerous for someone to just go in and use it without understanding that, look, it's not that there's 17 people in this zip code that have this thing, that's not, you can't just go around saying that. Do you want someone to be able to go in and be able to do that, or do you want to sort of protect someone from making a claim like that without understanding the scope of how the data works?
Well, I think we want the user like that. We want the high school student who's doing a paper to go in and find our data. And I mean, they may not understand the margin of error. They may not even look at it. In terms of the synthetic data, I don't think that applies, because if we someday end up doing something synthetic, years or however we get the data, it's our best estimate. No, I think we want as many users using our data as we can. I mean, it's not just for the power user. Yeah, no offense to anybody in this room.
Just to clarify, where we are exploring, primarily having fully synthetic data is in a separate microdata release. It's not in the tables. So it's more likely that if they were looking for some data at the ZICTA level, that they would get that probably from our published tables, which at this point, there is no plans to make that fully synthetic. The fully synthetic is really a means of protecting a full-scale microdata, where we use it within our current internal microdata is more on a limited basis. It's an alternative to swapping, basically, but that's not fully synthetic. That's a different animal.
I'll move over here so you guys can see me better. I'm sort of in everyone's blind spot, but I was wondering, so some of the housing figures for rent and, cost of like housing on the ACS is not the same as like what is on Zillow. There's a huge gap between those two things, or those two, the private data and then what the ACS provides. Are you guys considering, because I know third-party data sources were also mentioned, but it wasn't really gotten into. Have you guys considered getting data from Zillow or Realtor to sort of, supplement ACS figures?
Yeah, so we do currently use third-party or commercial data as part of our data sources, and so I expect we'll continue to do that. As with, I think there was a conversation earlier about discussion of comparing statistics across different sources. I mean, everybody uses different methods for producing those numbers, so the difference in the data is not necessarily a concern, so to speak. It's potentially a different method, different source, different reference period, or different use of that data. So, but it is definitely a source we're pursuing to incorporate in with our respondent data. Does that make sense?
Not really. Sorry, I'm going to be the person with like two more follow-up questions. So I guess it's so are you saying that, because I know that, there are programs that use ACS data or census data to then, like, for example, HUD vouchers.
Mhm.
So if there's a huge gap between like, that could potentially impact something like a HUD voucher and how much a family is getting in, like, maybe a city where housing costs are high. So I guess like that's where what I'm thinking of. And that's why I don't necessarily understand your response. So if you, maybe if you could like rephrase or respond to like the example I gave you, or I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't have a specific answer to that specific example because as we move through using commercial data or other data sources as part of administrative records to inform our estimates, we look at the potential impact on those estimates for the federal uses that we're required to collect that data for. So that's part of the decision-making process and working with HUD to evaluate where the estimates may change and understanding those impacts. So it's all baked into the process of working with our subject matter experts, working with our federal partners who, you know, require our collection of the data and evaluating our data sources and for quality and for us to decide if we're going to use that data as part of producing the estimates and what methods we're going to use that data to produce our estimate.
I was just going to clarify that she mentioned that we are currently using third-party data sources. We're currently using them in the research phase at this point and testing with like planned implementation for, like we talked about, you know, whether it's acreage or and that other potential use cases in the 2024-2025 timeframe. So I just wanted to make sure that we were clear on that. Home value is not something that we're, you know, is currently influencing the ACS estimates. And you will get differences and to some extent, differences on a housing unit level is okay. Because if they agree, let's say we just pulled that data in directly, then somebody else can take that data and match it to our ACS data and get address level matches up to our PUMs, and that would be bad. So that is something that we're taking into consideration. How do you use that data so you can't just easily match up that third-party data directly? You want to have the same, you know, similar statistical properties, like what's the median home value in this area. You would want to have those things sort of be preserved, but having it match at an address level could be, you know, very problematic from a disclosure standpoint. So that's one facet that we've had to continue to take into consideration as we've been doing all of this administrative record data, because these are external data sets. These are available to bad actors as well as people who would use them for good or whatever.
Amanda, did you have a follow-up to this?
I also just wanted to point out there was some reference earlier to you know, there's already been some research done on this, and some of that research has been published actually on the Census Bureau website. So I think there was a paper a few years ago, and I don't know, I haven't been up to date on if anything else has been released since then, but where we did look at the comparison of the commercial, like a commercial mix compared to already released ACS data. I believe it's called housing. Maybe you might be, is housing administrative record simulation. Yeah, I think if you Google that and census, you should be able to get it.
Thank you, Amanda. All right, I saw Joe had a question.
Okay. You mentioned before, and we've discussed obviously the synthetic PUMs. Put that aside for a minute. How do you characterize the current state of your work on the tabulation, on the published tabulations from the ACS on the disclosure avoidance front? How would you characterize that right now?
Well, I think well, our focus was on the synthetic PUMs in the talk by Rolando. A lot of the work for, you know, is formal privacy what would it look like for a sample survey? That work is being worked on by our partners in academia through the cooperative agreements. And it's very much in the, say, the basic research phase, like not even the research phase of how do you apply it. It's the research phase of how do you characterize formal privacy in that context? Because it's not like the differential privacy that you had for the census. That just doesn't work with the sample survey. The reason is because in the census, one person can influence those tabulations up or down by one, whether they are included or not. In a sample survey, they can influence it by however as large as the sampling weight is within that survey, which could be in 1,000 for an ACS, or in some surveys could be, tens of thousands. So it could have a huge impact. And if you try to inject noise to cover whether somebody moved an estimate up or down by 1,000 or 10,000, the amount of noise you have to inject is just, it completely destroys the data. So there's really a lot of very basic research on how do you think about the problem. First of all, start with a very simple case and slowly work your way up to something that is anywhere near as complicated as the ACS. And this is why, implementing formal privacy in the ACS by 2024 or 2025 is completely out the window, because we don't even have the basic science there yet to even start to think about what that looks like. And that is going to take some time before we ever get to that point. And then, we think about all of the applications or the dialogue that happened with the 2020 census and data users, and how do you fine tune the application and all of that. If you think all the work that had to go on with the 2020 census, that started with them already having the science and being able to do differential privacy, right? And then there was this whole work together with the data user community that followed that. So we're not even up to that point of even saying, how do you do this? Or how do you, what's the mathematical representations of things you need to do in order to try to do something?
Well, I'm going to keep the short-term tradition here by asking a follow-up. You determined you needed formal privacy by that reconstruction that was done using 2010 published data. How do you know that it's even needed for the ACS, given the absence of such a thing? Is it an assumption that this is going on?
We're going to defer this over to Rolando.
Rolando, you've already suffered enough.
Can you hear me? Sorry to steal it from the panel, but we do not use re-identification studies to show there is no risk in the survey. Right? If we do a re-identification study and it shows there's a risk, then that says we need to reevaluate how we're doing. But not having one done, or having one done that didn't show risk with a particular attack modality, doesn't mean that there's still ways that respondent identity could be, or respondent attributes could be compromised. So while we are planning to do another re-identification study on ACS, and I never answered Sally's question, which was, yes, there has been a previous study done. It used, I believe, social media data rather than as a commercial data. So it really isn't comparable to the experiment we did for 2010. But we're going to do one of that kind on ACS. But even if it shows that there's not a large level of risk of that particular attack, I think we still need ways of moving towards privacy frameworks that can let us mathematically show how much privacy we're buying for a given amount of accuracy that we need from the survey. It's going to take a while to get there, given the scientific issues that Mark talked about.
In other words, how far do you have to take this is really up in the air.
Yes.
Okay.
But I mean, there's a lot of juicy research for our academic partners, so they're on it.
So 2047?
Before I
I'm
retire,
sorry, I don't mean to make light. It's later in the day, so I have that excuse, but this is a serious, I mean, this is like,
Of course it's serious. And I mean, I think that to Mark's point, right, if we could just do the ACS as a simple random sample, we would know better how to do DP. But there's another dimension there with the survey, right, is cost. And so we can't do that for cost reasons. And so there are ways we do sample selection, there's ways we do weighting adjustments, all to try to reduce costs and get more accuracy. Every single one of those production decisions has to be evaluated under the context of a formally private framework before we can really answer these questions in earnest.
thank you.
Actually, can I, we have some online questions that, and some that have been upvoted, which is great. We have that feature. Okay, so this comes from P. Rafael Hernandez Arias, Research Director, Community Health Assets and Needs Assessment. Nationally, we have limited data about population and health. Are there any plans to expand the few questions in ACS?
Okay, so the expansion of content on the ACS requires a federally mandated reason in order to add content. There is a, it has to have a legal justification. It has to start with a request from a federal agency. And then we have a very, very formal process that we go through in order to put content on to the ACS. So the example I used earlier, the SOGI content, the reason that we're doing that testing is because we have a Department of Justice request that met the strict legal requirements in order to add content to the ACS. And therefore we're pursuing it, testing those questions for the survey without those same kind of legal requirements and review by the legal team. We don't just get to add content. It doesn't belong, the survey doesn't belong to us. It belongs to the federal agencies in order for us to collect the data for them for those federal reasons.
Great, thank you. Another question.
I was just
online
gonna
that was-
add one
Oh,
thing
sorry.
to that. And that is part of the vision that the Bureau has been looking towards is things that can leverage existing products that go beyond sort of just always adding more content to a particular survey, but how can you blend products from multiple surveys? So there's been a couple different research papers in the past decade where we've looked at combining the survey of income and program participation along with the ACS, and also combining the National Health Interview Survey with the ACS. And you can use the combination of those two items and use the fact that the ACS asks more basic questions on, say, the disability questions, but then use the more detailed questions from the SIP survey and combine those in order to improve the precision of the SIP estimates by leveraging the ACS, and similarly do the same thing with the National Health Interview Survey. And I think it's these kinds of products that offer a lot of promise to be able to get us new products that we didn't have before, but without having to further burden the ACS respondents with even a longer questionnaire that could decrease our response rates further.
Great, thank you. There's a lot of hands in the room. There's actually a lot of questions online that we need to get through, and some of them have been upvoted a couple times, so they're very popular. So I'm gonna try to ask those first, those ones with 2 upvotes, and I'll circulate around again. So this one says, Jonathan Nygreen says, as I understand it, the population estimates branch updates its population estimates from time to time, but unlike other programs using these data, the ACS doesn't update its numbers retroactively. Could you explain the reason for this?
Yes, there's a couple reasons for that. One is that those numbers get historically used as official numbers for the lifespan that they're up there. including for programmatic purposes and that type of thing. The second major item is this was a decision that was made for fairly early on because of the processing requirements to reprocess what is, I think we're no longer 11 billion, we're 8 billion estimates or something like that. If you had to go back and do that for the entire time series, let's say in 2020 and reconstruct all the way back to 2010, we're talking about adding an additional 80 billion estimates, and that would simply swamp our ability to keep releasing the current estimates. So we decided early on to keep our focus on releasing the latest numbers and always coming out just with those.
Thank you. All right. Another one with 2 upvotes, Jan Vink from Cornell says the online documentation on data suppression is from 2016. I have the feeling that I run more and more into suppressed data, for example, missing data for some random pumas. Is the documentation still accurate? Guidance on why a certain data point is suppressed would be helpful.
Can you repeat, was that for the PUMS file?
It doesn't say, so I think you can interpret that how you would like, if you'd like to speak to the PUMS file.
Well, I can speak to either. So we had a couple data processing or data collection issues in the past 5 or so years. That did lead to some targeted suppressions for that reason in both the 1 and 5 year products, and that included the public use files. Now, we also had with our data quality filtering, that applies to the 1 year data. There may be some trends there with our lower response rates where we have fewer interviews in a particular geographic area. That our data quality filtering basically says, is the average estimate within this table significantly different from 0? Or it's actually the median, but it's what's your typical estimate look like? And if more than half of the estimates are not statistically significantly different from 0, we filter that table for that geography. So we may see slightly higher filtering rates for in this past year or two because of that, and because we've had a reduced number of interviews.
Great, thank you. Are there any plans to update that documentation since that he referenced from 2016 or?
So we have a suppression document from 2016 that is in the process of being reviewed and making sure that everything is current. We've not had major changes from that. The one thing I can think of that may be not present is the filtering that we do for medians that are based upon 1 or 2 sample cases. We do an interpolated median for that essentially, makes sure that we're not disclosing information, but that information ends up being fairly meaningless. So at the request of the subject matter experts, they requested that we suppress the median data for that. And so that may be something that is seen in both the 1 and 5 year tabular data.
All right, I'm going to ask one more question from the online because I think it's actually a fairly early and more universal question for a lot of users, which is Nick Coleman asks, hello, city planner here. My department has always used the 5 year ACS estimates in annual reports and in fulfilling data requests due to lower MOE. However, recently we learned that comparing adjacent 5 year estimates is not advised. Should we be using 1 year ACS for data we report annually?
So there's a couple different things and what you can think about in terms of with the 5 year estimates. A key thing is if you are going to be using data for multiple geographies and they are of different sizes, then you want to use the 5-year estimates, because that gives you the same data set, sort of this, the same basis of what you're estimating for all of the geographies. So that is really an overriding importance. Now, the guidance for comparing what we call overlapping 5-year estimates. So Dave referred to the Caterpillar track where you have 2016 through 2020 overlapping with the 2017 through 2021. And you get, 4 years of overlap between those two. If you shouldn't compare them as though you could take a difference between them and consider that to be a difference between 2020 and 2021, because it's really more complicated than that. If you wanted to say, look at a time series, how are things changing over time, and you were plotting, 10 5-year estimates out across the chart, you could do that, just not comparing successive estimates, but more so looking at what's the trend over time. That's a reasonable use case. But you shouldn't interpret overlapping estimates and subtract the two and say that's 2020 minus 2021, vice versa, because you also have a difference in that in the 1 year you've added 21 and you drop 16, which means when you look at the difference, you're really looking at, well, what's the difference between 21 and 2016? And that's a much more complicated thing to think about. So if you're just presenting the data, I don't see a problem with just presenting that 5-year estimate, but looking at, treating it as though it was a year-to-year change. That's where the problem in the interpretation comes.
Yeah, and I would go, I would add to that, if the data are available at the 1-year level, it would also be good to plot that just to see if there's trends within the 1 year that might be smoothed out over the 5-year. I see what Mark is saying and I agree with him, but if you can do it with the 1-year data, if it has 65,000 or more people. Now, if you aren't really doing comparisons, but you're just looking at a point estimate, like you're distributing money in the city to different areas based on their population, certainly you can use the most recent data. Like HUD does that, they update their data every year with the newest 5-year. But they aren't doing a comparison per se. It isn't like they're taking this 5-year and comparing it to the last 5-year. So does that make sense? Well, I know the person's online who asked that question, so I can't really get that, but I'm hoping that makes sense too. Hopefully they're nodding their head, yes.
I'm not that person. I'm a different person. So a follow-up question, a few steps previous, talking about the question of adding new questions to the ACS, and there's that review process and purpose and so on. And then talking about how it's different if you're doing new linked data products, where you're not adding new questions to the survey. It's information you already have, but the new step is the linkage. And one thing I was just curious about is, what does the review process look like? The typical, privacy, integrity, et cetera, for new linked data products.
Okay, so for the actual formal process for adding new content to the ACS, we have an infographic, and I'm happy to share it, and we can get that to PRB and they can send it out to the users, the attendees today. That is a public document, and it shares that process that we go through in order to add new content or even modify or revise the content on the ACS. A blended data product typically, and up to now anyway, uses publicly available data that's already published. And I like to think of it as a mashup, right? And we're mashing up our data with other survey data or other program data and things like that. So there's no privacy concerns when it comes to our piece of the pie because it's a publicly available data source. So unless I'm mistaken there, Mark, so
Yeah,
he
for-
could correct me.
For a blended data, so I don't know, they have all these terms now for how they combine data, but a blended data product, you could, say, take a account from an ACS as a numerator and have the denominator come from econ data. There's some examples of things that have been done that way. If you were to do more of a modeled type situation where, that would depend on what kind of model that you would create, whether that was an area level model, may be able to use published estimates. But if you were doing a unit level model, then you may have to do that within an FSRDC or something of that nature. The work with the NHIS, that was some collaborative work between the Census Bureau and CDC, where they were, CDC was particularly interested in seeing whether or not they could publish for lower levels of geography for the NHIS. So, they each had an opportunity to potentially learn from that, and that was some collaborative work there. That was done at a research level. I'm not certain on all of the results and whether they were happy with them or that kind of thing, but certainly that type of way of combining ACS with other surveys is something that was rich in our history. It was considered back in the early proposal documents from the early 90s, because they recognized that this was something that was would be a huge benefit to having something like the ACS, because the other demographic surveys tend to ask very detailed questions, but they have smaller sample sizes, and the ACS is sort of the exact flip of that, and it offers a great promise. So just saying, it would depend on how the process was done. If it was, for example, if you tried to link data to say the ACS PUMs, for example, whether that was exactly NHIS data or you use the results of those models to create synthetic variables that could be added to it. If I don't know if we have a representative who can speak to sort of how SIP does this for their what's called SIP synthetic beta, which is a data set that is fully synthetic and uses a validation server. It's sort of a one model that we can fashion what we've looked at for the a fully synthetic ACS. And in that case, they use joining synthetic SIP data with ADRAC data, and it's sort of another way of blending data like that. But it would depend on really the how and what that's done. And I think Dave
Yeah.
wants to add in.
Yeah, well, if you're talking about, let's say, we have questions, we have topics on the ACS, and there's an administrative record topic that we can match and put out new tables, in a sense, add a new topic to the ACS without adding questions. The questions on doing that wouldn't be what Eli was talking about in terms of, because that's about the burden on the public, but it would be a data quality issue, disclosure issue, it would also be, we would have to do it too. I mean, it would have to be, somebody would have to make a decision that that work should be done on that data set, and it would have promise that we can link it up and create a new topic. And that's been talked about for some time in the future, but we don't have anything going on basically adding a variable to the ACS microdata for a tabulation from another source. If that's what you're trying to get at a little bit. You're welcome.
Yeah, I'm Matt Berman. I'm actually from the University of Alaska. So, but I think I'm probably not going to ask this question very well, but I'm struck with the whole day here that we've been talking about the Census Bureau's walking this, trying to meet the needs of data users and also deal with the data privacy, protect people's privacy. And it just seems that the more we talk about it, the more it seems to me to be a losing battle. Like we're not going to win this. What this Chuck Homeless person, I don't know who it was talking about Zillow. I went on Zillow to look up my house, my address, to see what it said there, just for fun. And it had my house there. It had pictures of the outside, it had the value, it had the fact that I owned it and I lived there, which is public information. My salary is public information because I work for the University of Alaska, which is a state institution, so anybody can get my salary. And it's the main thing, what is there that I could give the ACS that the public doesn't already know? And so basically the ACS, the Census Bureau is trying to do what it can within Title 13 and how it's interpreting Title 13. So at some point, so Title 13 puts no regulations on the private sector. And so Zillow can get all this information, put it all together with essentially no regulation whatsoever. And the big data, there's Google, there's all these private data sources and public data sources that the Census Bureau can't control, and that's going to keep growing. And when you have AI being able to put this together, AI may have generated the photos of the interior of my house, which of course Zillow had, but they couldn't possibly, they've never been there. Nobody's been there to take those photos, but they were disturbingly accurate. The furnishings weren't right, but but the interior, even to the exposed interior beams that they could tell from somehow from the outside, they could tell that they were there. So given all this, at some point, I think that the Census Bureau and the users need to think more about the law, about Title 13. The Title 13 is basically making it impossible for the census to do its job. And it's going to become increasingly that. And as long as we just, put the government under tight regulation about not disclosing privacy, but there's nothing about the private sector, we're losing. There's nothing we can do. And so I'm just put this out as there, at some point, we might think as users of the data users community that we need to address Title 13 and maybe work with Congress and the administration, whatever administration it is, to revisit that and say, maybe we need to revise it somehow and both include the private sector and data privacy and public sector and come up with a rational strategy for the future where AI is going to be able to reproduce all of us practically without any data. I don't know if you can answer that question, but I'm thinking for this panel, thinking about being willing to help and work with the data users and think about how we should probably try to revise Title 13 to make it consistent with the digital age.
Okay, but that's a very interesting concept. I've never thought about that. Title 13 is the law, though, that we do work under. And so we are moving forward. We will be working with Title 13 as best we can and being the active data stewards for the protecting the confidentiality of our respondents. So that's what we work under. That's what we are sworn for life to protect. And it does make it difficult for us sometimes to do our job, or for us to have conversations with the data user community and to have those conversations about accuracy and privacy and things like that. But that's the balance that we need to strike. And I'm highly confident that we can get there with still protecting the respondent data. And
I have a thought. We have like over 40 topics or so on the ACS, and administrative data is available for some, like the ones you mentioned. But a lot of the topics on the ACS, there is no administrative record data. Believe me, we've been looking. And if anything, that makes it more important that we do check the data, because we don't want somebody to be able to go to Zillow or something like that, find it, and then, as Mark said, find their record in the Palms or in a tabulated data set or something like that. It's required to fill this out by law, and it has penalties stated on there. And the deal with that is that we promise to protect the data. So I think it would be very different if we didn't have Title 13. My guess is our responses would, when we couldn't make that pledge to the American public and uphold it, then I think we'd have bigger problems. Yeah, I see your point, but it's a big survey.
I had a question on the status of the ACS 2017 to 2021. Is there anything available yet? And if not, when do you anticipate it?
are you talking about the 5-year data product for 17 to 21? That's already out.
Or
What do you mean?
Are you thinking of the selected population tables and American Indian Alaska Native tables?
Well, anything. I mean, I'm primarily interested in transportation stuff, and I'm actually working with FHWA on, support for the
you're talking about
ACS.
CTPP? Is he looking for the CTPP?
Are you talking about the Census Transportation Planning Package, the CTPP special tab that we do?
Yeah, that's still
Okay.
in,
Yeah.
it's still being developed, but I
Right.
mean, is there any
But the-
ACS data out there? Is the ACS holding this process up, or
No,
is the ACS data actually out there?
no, the 2017 to 2021 5-year data were released in December of
Okay,
22. So they are out there on data.census.gov.
okay, all right. So we could do our own analysis on it independent
Yes.
of.
Sure.
Yes, and then we
Okay.
do have the 1 year is, like I had said earlier, is coming out in September and in October, and we've got the December 7th, 2023 will be the next 5-year product, which is do I have this right? 18 to 22, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. I gotta count 5 years. So yes, the 18
Okay,
to
but
22
since
product.
last,
is this-
yeah, since last December though, 2017 or 2021 is available.
Correct. Yes, it's out.
Okay.
It's out there for public consumption.
And I have another question.
Sure.
When we do the CTPP thing with the ACS, we always publish margins of error, but the average person doesn't really know what a good margin of error is. Is there any sort of guidance document that the ACS has on, what a reasonable margin of error is to, if it's here, use it. If it's here, don't use it, something like that, some sort of guidance.
So as I recall, I believe the Compass handbooks have some information with that's in it used to be as part of a common appendix, but it looks like no longer. But what we have always told people is it really comes down to what your particular use case is. I mean, are you using this estimate for something that's going to cost a lot of money? Well, then you probably want as small a margin of error as you can get, right? Sometimes it's just like, is this in a new emerging population within particular area. Yeah, are we seeing a growth in a particular race groups within this, sub area of the city or something like that? And in those cases, you can live perhaps with a larger margin of errors because what you're wanting to see is, are we picking up anybody in the ACS, first of all? And the presence of anybody having any non-zero estimate means we found at least one person. And then the margin of error is just sort of how confident are we that that's not the only person in that city of that particular race group, or who happens to carpool in a car driven world. It's so it really depends on that application. We looked at the potential of doing sort of can we put a stoplight on ACS estimates that says use it with confidence or caution, or don't use it. Some other I know state data centers have done that. I want to say the Missouri State Data Center had an application that was like that at one point. And so we've tried to sort of give, some guidance on it, but what we use like for our data quality filtering is almost, it's at a level where like, okay, yeah, you really probably shouldn't be using this estimate. And the threshold we use is where the margin of error is equal to the size of the estimate. Now, the only reason we use that is because we want to put out as much data as we can. But in your particular use case, you may select something smaller. I know the econ area, they do a data suppression, I think with it's like a 50% CV, so it's a little bit less. Some other cases, they may use 30%, but all of these are just numbers, right? And eventually you have to find what's your own balance for your particular use case. If you're doing something at a state level, you're probably going to get pretty decent, margins of error on your estimates. And so there, you're probably going to use a different threshold than if you're looking at track level data, for example. That probably doesn't give you as precise of an answer as you'd like, but it's just kind of, use your best judgment based on the application that you're doing and sort of what's reasonable with the data.
Excellent. Well, we have more questions online, but I think we've run out of time. It's now 5 o'clock. I want to thank everyone for staying to the very end. And please, a warm round of applause for our panel of experts.